Hi everyone, welcome to the inaugural 2017 Visual Politics Seminar. I'm Sally Butler from Art History and I'm standing in for Roland, Professor Roland Bleicher, the head of our Visual Politics Research Cluster. He can't be here and has a family emergency in Zurich, so he's asked to send his apologies to Sue and wish us well in our first seminar. So, I would like to introduce, and Sue, you may have to correct me because you change roles so often, but Professor Sue Best from the Queensland College of Art at Griffith University is Deputy Director of Postgrad and Research at QCA and Director of the Griffith Centre for Creative Arts Research. Her most recent books have included Visualising Feeling, Affect in the Feminine Avant-Garde from 2011, and last year Reparative Aesthetics, Witnessing in Contemporary Art Photography, and Sue gave a fantastic paper here last year on that. She's also a curator and has curated an exhibition of South American art of the 1960s and 70s at University of Sydney, and in 2015 and 16 an exhibition that was related to reparative aesthetics, which showed at Griffith Art Gallery in the University of Sydney. I won't preempt your paper, so I'll hand over to you for today's talk. Thanks, Sue.
Thank you very much. So the paper today is a kind of a spin-off, or at least the method of it is a spin-off from my book Reparative Aesthetics, which analyses the work of 4 women photographers from the Southern Hemisphere. And I argue that these women are pioneering a reparative approach to shameful histories. This paper uses the same method, in effect, to look at the work of Brisbane-based Indigenous artist Judy Watson. So I'm transposing an existing framework across. My approach to repair is deeply indebted to the queer theorist Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, and particularly her account of what she calls reparative reading practices. And Sedgwick in turn borrows the idea of a reparative position or orientation from the psychoanalyst Melanie Klein, for whom it signals the capacity to tolerate ambivalence. And she has a very particular take on that term, that it means for her to be able to hold together both positive and negative feelings about something. So it's not how we normally think of that term. So the reparative position is not simply about undoing or reversing damage. Ambivalence precludes what might be seen as normally that more positive connotation of the term repair. So this way of thinking about repair should enable the incorporation of intense negative emotions and experiences, so horror of annihilation, anger, despair, alongside positive feelings like tenderness, love and hope. And Sedgwick in particular emphasises that pleasure should be part of this complex mix of emotions. So in this paper I'm looking at Watson's, it's kind of weird calling you Watson, series, The Holes in the Land, where this complexity of address is particularly evident, so where that mix of complex emotions is present. So Sedgwick's and Klein's account, I think, is particularly pertinent to this series called The Holes in the Land. And obviously while ambivalence tends to suggest indecision, oscillation between positions or indifference, for Sedgwick and Klein it's an inclusive term that catches up the complexity of feeling that follows destruction. And obviously Klein is looking at it just at a psychic level, but this could also, and this is where the transposition occur at a social level. So in terms of Indigenous urban Australian art, that's an unusual position, that kind of ambivalence. More commonly, as Australian art historian Ian McLean has recently argued, anger is the typical emotion. He writes, and I'm quoting from his Rattled Spears book, beginning of quote, "A deep anger at historical injustice is the driving force of nearly all urban art, no matter how divergent its themes, subjects and approaches," end quote. So to highlight the effective tone of an important strand of Australian contemporary art is an unusual move on Ian McLean's part. The effective turn, which has swept through other disciplines in the humanities and social sciences, still has fairly limited purchase in art history. Generally, critical commentary in art history and criticism highlights political and social issues addressed by urban Indigenous art rather than being so explicit about the underpinning feelings. That said, anger at past injustice is certainly not limited to urban Aboriginal art. It's been a key feature of identity politics in Australia as well as many other countries. And as I argue in Reparative Aesthetics, typically identity politics takes one of two forms. First, there's the paranoid type, which frequently entails the expression of anger at wrongdoing past and present. These misdemeanours are exposed by artists in their pointed critique of the state of things. And the alternative form of identity politics art is less anger-fuelled. It counters or replaces negative stereotypes with positive ones. And Sian and I succinctly describe this approach as the uplift aesthetic. The effective tenor of this kind of art is usually celebratory. So to just give one example that you might all know, the Indigenous artist Brooke Andrew has uplifted, that's the Sian and I term, a typical ethnographic photograph of an Aboriginal man by amplifying body decorations and adding across his chest the text "sexy and dangerous." Andrew thereby directs the viewer towards a positive reading of the photograph as surely as ideology critique, which is the other type of identity politics art, usually underscores the negative. McLean's analysis of the importance of anger is most pertinent then to the first type of identity politics, insofar as the effective tone of that work is often angry. And anger is, of course, an emotion that's usually attributed to men. As Elizabeth Spellman notes, for women, and I'm quoting her here, anything resembling anger is likely to be described as hysteria or rage instead, end quote. Although, as Kathleen Woodward points out, anger was a key feminist emotion, justified with recourse to the idea of what she calls outlaw emotions, emotions experienced by those who are oppressed. In her conclusion to the essay, however, she queries the ongoing validity of this emotion beyond the early stage of a political struggle, cautioning against what she calls the corrosive effects of righteous habit-forming anger. And again, that's her expression. So this feminist reappraisal of anger reinforces the significance of Watson's ambivalent stance. Her work, The Holes in the Land, cannot straightforwardly be classified as an expression of anger, but anger and sorrow are not excluded from the series either. As the title underscores, the series of 6 engravings is about loss, and I should show you just, I'll flick back to some of these in a minute. It's specifically the loss of cultural patrimony, and in 4 of the 6 images, Aboriginal cultural objects held in the British Museum are depicted. Mostly they're from the northern Australia, obviously from Queensland, which is where Watson's country is located. The series is a result of a fellowship in 2013 at the British Museum. It was part of a larger project called Engaging Objects, which was a collaboration between the Australian National University, the British Museum and the National Museum of Australia in Canberra. And the fellowship took place in the lead up to 2 important exhibitions of the British Museum's Indigenous Australian collections that resulted from that research collaboration. The Indigenous Australia, Enduring Civilisation, which was at the British Museum in 2015, and Encounters at the National Museum of Australia in Canberra in 2015. So Watson's series was shown in Unsettled, an exhibition of the work of 5 Indigenous artists that was framed as a response to the Canberra exhibition. As an artistic fellow with rare access to British Museum collections, she was positioned more like an insider, albeit a temporary one. And certainly the series departs from the accusatory or outsider position of institutional critique, familiar from political work about museum collections from the 1990s. And a sort of typical example here is the work of African-American artist... how do I go backwards? Am I going backwards? No, I'm not going anywhere.
You are. Yeah.
Oh, am I? Oh, there I am.
It's gone.
Oh. What have I done? So good at driving. So this is African American artist Fred Wilson's Mining the Museum from 1992 to 3, and it was a project for the Maryland Historical Society using their collection. And famously in this exhibition case, he juxtaposed ornate silverware with slave shackles, which you can see in the middle. And the shock of these two types of metalwork sharing the same space makes explicit the dependence of the genteel life of Maryland society on the forced labour of African American slaves. So Watson's project is very differently motivated, as the objects she depicts are all of Indigenous manufacture. The profound feelings stirred up by being able to reconnect with these objects is well expressed by Shane Williams, a Durrell elder, as he put it, and I'm quoting, "In a spiritual sense, it would be good to hold them again, just the way our ancestors held them, even in 1770. For us, they feel like our national treasure," end quote. So the final image in the series, which is titled The Holes in the Land 6, which you can see here, shows a table case with drawers, the kind of accommodation or resting place for these objects in the British Museum. The objects in Watson's series are mainly, however, liberated from storage. They range from these two works from patchouli bags fabricated in two very different ways, wooden clubs, a paddle, and skirts or aprons worn by women, all of which I'll show you in more detail shortly. They are all etchings that are rendered, the objects, as you can see here, are rendered in black so that they register as shadows, or perhaps it might be better to say shades of their former selves. As you can see in these images, the actual objects are more textured and volumetric than a shadow could ever be. And I think if you're closer to them, you can see the texture on, particularly the one on the left, but also the one on the right. So they're positioned on the uppermost layer of the etchings. They're also very insistently present, so it's kind of interesting that they're both shadow and yet very present. These treasured cultural objects are overlaid onto various architectural floor plans from the British Museum, and you can see them in the background, that square on the right-hand side and equally the more detailed one on the left there. So it's that gridded structure with then a more organic shape floating across. Watson describes the relationship between these two layers, both obviously dark layers of the image. I'm quoting, "I like the idea of the plans of the museum being the bones of the work and the objects being shadows floating across the top of them." Despite their shadowy form, the objects are also translucent, so that they convey light as much as dark, and that's another kind of intriguing aspect about it, that they're not simply dark, that you do get a sense of light passing through. As I mentioned, so these two depict bags of patchouli. Anthropologist and British Museum curator Lysant Bolton explains that it's a plant with narcotic properties which grew in southwestern Queensland along the fringes of deserts and was a much desired commodity traded across vast distances. The labels from the British Museum are of particular interest to Watson, and where possible are displayed as part of the wall text for the work. The text indicates that, in going to a close-up, you have a better sense of the complexity of the image in this slide. One of the bags was taken from near Gregory River, which is one of the rivers running through Watson's country. And the intimate substance of manufacture is human hair, and I think you can see that texture better than this image, which makes the material and metaphorical link to possible ancestors incredibly strong. The other containers are made from very different substances. They're wool from government blankets, and these objects can be seen perhaps more clearly in the video, The Keepers from 2016, which is a work that relates obviously to this same experience. Bolton describes the reuse of these government-issued blankets as a complex act. As she says, at one level, the taking of an instrument of colonial control and transforming it is ironic and playful, but it also represents an innovative adaptation of new materials for local purposes, which is something that's evident in many other objects that survived the colonial era, end quote. So the blankets are usually seen as creating dependence on colonial powers and displacing Indigenous practices such as the making of possum skin cloaks. Here, however, they are repurposed, creating strikingly modern-looking objects. So I guess you can see that gives you a better sense of those objects. In the second image in the series, The Holes in the Land 2, there are 2 wooden clubs and a paddle made from a variety of mangrove wood. The clubs are from Moreton Bay. It's interesting that the deadpan descriptions of the objects from the British Museum, as you'd expect, avoid aesthetic evaluation, so they leave unremarked the incredible sensual shape of that central paddle, as well as, obviously, with most of the objects. The fourth image in the series, this is The Holes in the Land 4, depicts what's referred to as 2 aprons, and the label says, with greater level of precision, it's a fringe of ochred opossum hair strings on a 4-ply cord of human hair. And again, it's described as an apron worn by women from the Mara tribe from MacArthur River in the Northern Territory. The presence of hair again draws the objects incredibly close. Although obviously in this etching the apron is hard to recognise as such. Set against a field of yellow, blue and ultramarine, it could be mistaken for seaweed or some other kind of fibrous underwater matter. In fact, apart from the paddle in the previous image, all of the objects are difficult to identify, and this is partly due to the way they're placed in the picture plane by Watson with little regard for relative scale or utility. Their placement creates incredibly strong diagonals in most of the images, thereby evoking energy and dynamism. Indeed, the images seem to drift or float across the picture plane, suggesting movement and a completely unexpected vitality when dealing with what could be regarded as deadened museal objects. You'll see how that diagonal is in almost all of them, adding to this sense of movement and sort of a floaty kind of space. The positioning of the objects is also very spatially complicated in terms of geography or location. They're suspended in an indeterminate space, a kind of limbo between the museum and their land of origin, Australia. The former, as I indicated earlier, is made present by reproducing the floor plans, which again you can see faintly in this image. While the latter appears through a variety of visual means. Mostly the land is suggested by these lush layers of lithographic wash, swirls of brilliant colour, redolent of aerial views of earth and sea. And the pigment simultaneously suggests waves, contour lines, and unseen energy, confounding a settled state. So you don't have a sense of this as being definitely land or definitely sea or definitely a topographical view. It's all of those things simultaneously. 2 images, The Holes in the Land 1 and this one, The Holes in the Land 4, also feature the broken lines and whirls that Watson has used to conjure a living land, simultaneously suggesting heat, dust, energy fields and mirage-like shimmerings. I think you can, I don't know it's probably better in the bigger one, isn't it? If you look to the sort of top right, you can see these broken lines in that one. I think you can probably see it more clearly in that one, these broken lines that sort of suggest a kind of that shimmering substance in those sort of different layers. So the sensitive integration of different realities in these complex layered images repatriates the shadow of the objects while also mourning their loss. In The Holes in the Land 1 and Holes in the Land 5, there are also large splashes of ochre, a precious pigment that also connotes blood, moving to this one. Emily explains, I'm quoting her, ochre is earth, its blood, its life. Ochre is the connection to place and country, to history and also the future, end quote. So the doubling of blood and ochre reminds us that some of the objects would have entered the collection after massacres. They were not necessarily innocently collected. So the suggestion of blood connects this series to one of Watson's previous works, A Preponderance of Aboriginal Blood, which some of you may be familiar with, recently acquired by the Tate. The 16 etchings in this series were the result of a commission by the State Library of Queensland to celebrate Queensland's centenary of women's suffrage and 40 years of Aboriginal suffrage. And the work, as you can see here, overlaid blood splatters onto official documents from the Queensland State Archives that determined whether Aboriginal people could vote. Before suffrage was granted, eligibility to vote was based on a specious issue of a percentage of Aboriginal blood, hence Watson's title. In the Holes in the Land 5, the spilt blood stains the plan of the drains and water pipes of the British Museum. So the orderly conduct of fluids and waste around the building is disrupted, flooded by the huge stain of blood like ochre. The profound locational ambiguity that can be seen in all of the works in the Holes in the Land is a consistent theme in Watson's practice. Louise Martin-Chew succinctly summarised how it operates in her paintings, and I'm quoting her here, as representations of landscapes more internal and metaphysical than actual. They are fresh in their tackling of the subject from the inside out. Watson has worked in this manner since the late 80s, after initially training as a printmaker. Multiple layers in each canvas create a drift, locating the viewer above, below, or somewhere within. So incredibly succinct way of capturing that geographical complexity that I was gesturing towards. Emphasising the viewer in this fashion really brings to the fore the way in which the images depart from the spatial habits of Western perspectival painting. The images seamlessly join together these very different spatial positionings, yet the viewer is not made to feel disoriented or dislocated, which obviously could be the result of that kind of ambiguity. So in other words, Watson's melding together of different realities doesn't operate in the confronting domain of shock or surprise. Despite that, she nonetheless maintains a critical stance about colonial collecting practices. As I mentioned earlier, the title suggests loss. It also poetically and poignantly points to the impact of removing this material from its place of origin. Such acts damage the land. The images, however, don't depict that damage directly. Again, in this regard, she departs from the typical approach to political art, which often underscores damage. For example, in the work of Indigenous artists such as Gordon Bennett, damage is explicitly depicted. His self-portrait, Interior-Exterior 1992, shows an exterior slashed by bloody welts, presumably caused by the whip hung alongside the canvas. The interior is inscribed with the masochistic message, "Cut me." It's unclear where the damage begins in this triptych. Does it start with the whip or the desire to be cut? Reading left to right, as we customarily do, one might think of this work as showing Frantz Fanon's idea of the epidermalisation of inferiority, that the outside inscription of black skin by colonial powers necessarily leads to the interiorisation of feelings of inferiority. It's a very strong, confronting and visceral work about skin laceration and self-laceration. Ian McLean was perhaps thinking specifically about Bennett when he characterised urban Aboriginal art as motivated by anger. In relation to Bennett, he writes, and I'm quoting, "The anger is never far from the surface of his work, though he was perplexed by the common perception of it as angry," end quote. Intriguingly, McLean also briefly notes the ambivalence that I've been slowly unpacking in Watson's work. However, he doesn't notice the gendered nature of the expression of anger or its absence, despite the fact that he classifies Watson's art in this fashion in the context of a discussion of 3 Indigenous women artists, Brenda Croft, Julie Goff, alongside Watson. While McLean puts his finger on the distinctive modality of these women's art, he does not read this as generating an alternative affective economy to the dominance of anger. Hence the complex emotional terrain of ambivalence described by theorists like Sedgwick and Klein is not broached. Watson herself is highly conscious of the way in which she combines the softening and ameliorating powers of aesthetics with the registration of sharper and more difficult political points. Beauty in her hands becomes like a slow release mechanism for her critical intentions. She states, and I'm quoting, "Art as a vehicle for invention and social change can be many things. It can be soft, hard, in-your-face confrontational, or subtle and discreet. I try and choose the latter approach for much of my work, a seductive, beautiful exterior with a strong message like a deadly poison dart that insinuates itself into the consciousness of the viewer without them being aware of the package until it implodes and leaks its contents. The subtle and discreet approach is reparative in an emotionally complicated way that correlates with Sedgwick's account of ambivalence in particular. The series The Holes in the Land is beautiful and seductive and thus aligned with the pursuit of pleasure. Move back from that. Yet it also generates thought about the loss of cultural patrimony and the shadow this casts on both institutions and communities. Because obviously that's implied by this, the shadows over both of these layers. The series enables thereby damage and repair to coexist in the same plane, delivering a critique of the colonial enterprise of collecting while also celebrating Indigenous cultural traditions of making. In place of what Sedgwick would call a paranoid reading, which would be more aligned with anger, which simply unveils damage, there's a reparative approach that's much more ambivalent, holding positive and negative together. And through this highly complex holding measure, the important project of identity politics is revitalised in engaging and thought-provoking ways. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Beautifully written and presented as usual, Sue. I'll interject just before questions and discussions. I should have introduced Judy. I didn't introduce her because she's so well known on campus, but I suddenly realised I should have introduced the artist, Judy Watson, who's present here. Not wanting to put you on the spot, but would you like to comment or add or say anything?
Well, we did have a bit of a pre-discussion about sort of the use of the term ambivalence, and I wasn't sure about it personally because I think that it carries negative connotations, and I think that my approach is about multi-layered, sort of readings of work that I want to convey to the viewer, but I can understand, and I love the idea of the anger and reparation and all of that. And so I think that picking of it is important, as a reading of the work, and I think, the way that you contextualised it is great. But the term itself I still find problematic.
I think the common sense meaning of it is not the way Sedgwick and Klein use it, but because the common sense reading of it is that it's sort of indecisive, or it sounds bland rather than complicated as a word.